For 1,000 years, give or take, a Greek city sent two of its teenage girls every single year into a city that hated them, where grown men were waiting on the shore specifically to kill them. This actually happened. Or at least the Greeks who lived through it were absolutely convinced it did for an entire millennium. Welcome to the strangest, longest-running punishment in the ancient world, one so serious that a king had to personally intervene to settle a legal dispute over it, and so real that a military manual from the 4th century BCE casually describes the smuggling tactics used to actually pull it off. Rewind to the fall of Troy. The city has just been sacked. In the chaos, a Greek warrior named Ajax, son of Oileus, not the more famous Ajax from the Iliad, drags the Trojan princess Cassandra away from the altar of Athena, where she had taken refuge as a suppliant, and assaults her, right there, inside the goddess's own temple. Athena does not let this go. According to the myth, she turns her own statue's eyes toward the ceiling in disgust, and later, as the Greek fleet sails home in triumph, she wrecks it in a storm. Ajax himself supposedly survives the shipwreck by clinging to a rock and boasting that he escaped despite the gods, at which point Poseidon simply splits the rock in half and lets him drown. You'd think that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Back home in Locris, on the Greek mainland, plague and famine strike the city for 3 straight years. Desperate, the Locrians consult an oracle, and the answer they get back is brutal in its specificity. Send 2 virgin girls to Troy every single year to serve in Athena's temple as atonement for what one of their own countrymen did. The first 2 girls sent, according to the historian Apollodorus, were named Paraboia and Cleopatra. And here's where the story stops sounding like a myth and starts sounding like an actual, sustained, real-world institution. Ancient sources describe exactly what happened when the girls arrived. They came shorn-headed, dressed in a single plain tunic, barefoot. And the Trojans, remembering exactly what a Locrian had done to their princess centuries earlier, were waiting for them. The girls had to run a gauntlet from the shore to the temple while Trojans threw stones at them. If they were caught and killed, their bodies were burned on wood specifically described as unfruitful, and the ashes were thrown into the sea, and Locris simply had to send replacements. If they survived the run, it didn't exactly get better. They spent the rest of their lives as temple servants, sweeping around the altar barefoot, forbidden to leave except at night, growing old, in the words of one ancient source, without ever wearing a proper veil again. Here's a question worth sitting with. If this was just a myth, a story people told without believing it, why does a 4th century BCE military strategy manual mention it as an ongoing logistical problem? The writer is Aeneas Tacticus, and his book isn't poetry or legend. It's a practical manual on defending cities under siege. And in it, discussing how difficult it is to stop people from sneaking into a well-guarded city, he casually mentions that the people of Ilium, meaning Troy, still haven't managed to stop the Locrian Maidens from getting in, despite constant watching, because a small group of men have, year after year, worked out ways to smuggle the girls in unnoticed. That's not myth-telling. That's a security consultant complaining that a centuries-old smuggling operation is still, currently in his own lifetime, outsmarting the guards. And there's harder evidence than that. Archaeologists have found an actual inscribed stone from Locris from around the 3rd century BCE laying out, in formal legal language, exactly how much money each pair of girls should receive for their upkeep and what happens to their property back home while they're gone. This wasn't folklore. It was civic policy, with a budget. At one point, according to the writer Aelian, the Locrian cities got into such a serious dispute over which of them was actually obligated to supply the girls that they brought the case to a king, Antigonus, one of Alexander the Great's former generals, to arbitrate. Picture that for a second. A Hellenistic monarch, ruler of actual armies and actual territory, sitting down to settle a legal argument about a punishment ritual for a crime committed outside Troy centuries earlier. The practice was finally discontinued, according to the historian Timaeus, after the end of the Third Sacred War in 346 BCE. You'd assume that was the end of the story. It wasn't. Sources say the tradition was later revived under one of the Hellenistic kings named Antigonus. In fact, that's probably the same Antigonus and the same dispute mentioned earlier. Historians date his arbitration to around 305 BCE, which places it after the practice had already lapsed once, right around the time it was being revived. Here's the honest complication though, and it matters. Ancient historians didn't even agree on how far back the practice actually went. The historian Polybius placed its origin before Locris even founded its Italian colony, sometime around the 8th century BCE. Another writer, Demetrius of Skepsis, argued for a much later starting point. Modern historians still don't have a clean answer. What we do know is that by the time Greek and Roman writers were describing it, they treated the 1,000-year figure less like a precise number and more like shorthand for, "This has been going on since anyone can remember." So somewhere between myth and municipal budget line items sits a punishment that outlasted the empires of the people who invented it. A crime committed in a few violent minutes inside a burning temple turned into a legal, financial, and diplomatic obligation that multiple Greek generations quite literally could not question their way out of, that required actual smuggling operations to sustain, and that needed a king's personal intervention just to figure out whose turn it was. If you like digging through exactly this kind of ancient uncertainty, where legend and civic bureaucracy turn out to be the same document, subscribe. There's a new one of these buried here every few days. Nobody today can tell you with total confidence exactly when the first two girls boarded that ship, or whether the 1,000 years was ever meant to be taken literally. What the evidence makes very hard to deny is that for centuries, real girls with real names ran a real gauntlet on a real beach because of something one man did in the chaos of a burning city, and an entire civilization decided that debt should outlive every single person who actually remembered why. And if you want to see how much of the wider Trojan War actually checks out, the city, the war, the myths built on top of it, I made a whole video walking through that evidence. It's linked right here.